In 1871, a German businessman with an obsession stood atop a windswept hill in northwestern Anatolia, convinced he had found what scholars dismissed as myth. Heinrich Schliemann's spade would soon bite into earth that had buried one of history's most debated questions. Did the Trojan War actually happen? For nearly 3,000 years, Homer's Iliad stood as literature's most magnificent war story, a tale of Helen's abduction, Achilles' rage, and a city destroyed by Greek fury and a wooden horse. But was it history or fantasy? The ancient Greeks themselves believed Troy was real. They made pilgrimages to its supposed location. Roman emperors claimed descent from Trojan refugees. Yet by the 19th century, European scholars had relegated the entire saga to the realm of mythology. Beautiful poetry masking complete fabrication. Schliemann's discovery changed everything. Beneath the Turkish hill called Hisarlik, he unearthed not one city, but 9 layers upon layers of settlements spanning millennia. He believed he had found Priam's treasure, the gold of Homer's Troy. He was wrong about the specific layer, but right about something more fundamental. A great Bronze Age city had indeed stood here, controlling the vital straits between Europe and Asia, perfectly positioned where Homer said Troy should be. The city Schliemann called Troy was real, but connecting archaeological ruins to epic poetry required far more careful work. In the decades following his initial excavations, successive teams of archaeologists refined the picture. The site revealed massive fortification walls, a lower town far larger than previously imagined, and evidence of wealth flowing from its strategic position, controlling maritime trade routes to the Black Sea. This was no minor settlement. This was a regional power. The layer known as Troy Savannah, dated to approximately 1200 before the Common Era, showed unmistakable signs of violent destruction. Skeletons lay where they fell. Fire had consumed buildings. Projectile points littered the ruins. Something catastrophic had befallen this prosperous city at precisely the period when ancient Greek tradition placed their legendary war. According to classical scholar M.I. Finley, whose work remains foundational to understanding Bronze Age Greece, the convergence of archaeological evidence with traditional chronology cannot be dismissed as coincidence, even as we remain cautious about specific details. But who are these Trojans? Homer called them allies of the Hittites. And Near Eastern texts confirm a powerful kingdom called Welusa in precisely this regina, name linguistically compatible with Ilias, the Greeks' other name for Troy. Hittite archives mention conflicts in western Anatolia, rebellions, and diplomatic marriages intended to secure peace. One letter references a place called Wailusa and its king Alexandru, eerily similar to Homer's Paris, whose alternate name was Alexandros. The Greeks who might have attacked Troy were themselves emerging from centuries of darkness. The Mycenaean civilization, centered in mainland Greece and characterized by fortress palaces at Mycenae, Tyrans and Pylos, dominated the Aegean world in the late Bronze Age. These were warrior aristocrats who spoke an early form of Greek, buried their dead with golden masks, and maintained complex administrative systems recorded in linear B-script. Their world revolved around warfare, raiding, and the accumulation of prestige through martial prowess. Around 1200 before the Common Era, this entire civilization collapsed. Within 50 years, nearly every major Mycenaean palace burned. Literacy vanished. Population plummeted. Trade networks disintegrated. The Eastern Mediterranean descended into chaos that scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse. When the Hittite Empire fell, Egyptian power contracted, and numerous cities throughout the region met violent ends. Into this historical maelstrom, we must place the question of Troy's destruction. Was it part of this broader catastrophe? Or was it, as tradition suggests, the target of a coordinated Greek expedition, perhaps the last great enterprise of Mycenaean civilization before its own destruction? To understand whether a Trojan War could have occurred, we must first understand why it would have mattered. Troy sat at one of the ancient world's most strategic locations, the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait controlling all maritime access to the Black Sea and its rich resources. Every ship carrying grain from the fertile coastlands, metals from Anatolia's interior, or goods from distant trading partners, had to pass within sight of Troy's walls. The city's wealth derived not from conquest, but from geography. Ships traveling northward into the Black Sea faced prevailing winds and currents that made the passage treacherous. Many captains chose to wait weeks for favorable conditions, anchoring near Troy, paying for supplies, offering harbor fees, and effectively enriching the city through enforced hospitality. Troy didn't need to blockade the straits. Nature did it for them, and Troy collected the proceeds. For the Mycenaean Greeks, this presented both opportunity and frustration. Their entire economy depended on maritime trade and raiding. The great palace centers of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns consumed vast quantities of bronze for weapons and tools, requiring constant imports of copper and tin. They acquired slaves, luxury goods, and prestige items through expeditions abroad. Control of trade routes meant power, and Troy's geographical position made it inherently wealthy and strategically valuable. The Mycenaean world operated on principles of competitive prestige among warrior elites. Kings gained authority through successful raids, distribution of plunder, and demonstrations of martial prowess. The greatest glory came from sacking wealthy cities. Archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean Greeks established trading posts and settlements throughout the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. They were expansionist, aggressive, and organized enough to mount substantial overseas expeditions. Historical precedent existed for coalitions of Greek forces. Linear B tablets reference military contingents, ship inventories, and armor production. The catalog of ships in Homer's Iliad, which lists contingents from across Greece, may preserve genuine Bronze Age political geography, suggesting remembered traditions of coordinated military action. Whether this specific coalition attacked Troy remains uncertain, but the organizational capacity existed. Economic motivations for conflict were profound. If Troy controlled or disrupted access to Black Sea trade routes, it directly threatened Mycenaean prosperity. If Troy allied with Hittite interests against Greek expansion, it represented a strategic obstacle. If Troy's wealth simply presented an irresistible target for raiders seeking glory and plunder, the expedition could have originated in the same impulses that drove countless Bronze Age military ventures. The Hittite archives, preserved in cuneiform tablets from their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia, reference repeated troubles in their western territories. They mention a place called Wailusa, almost certainly Troy, and conflicts involving a confederation of western Anatolian states called the Asua, possibly the origin of the name. Acacia. These texts describe rebellions, diplomatic interventions, and military campaigns in the precise region and time frame relevant to our question. One particularly intriguing document, the Toagalawa letter, describes Hittite diplomatic dealings with the king of Ahiawa, term most scholars now accept as the Hittite rendering of Achaean, Homer's name for the Greeks. The letter references conflicts in western Anatolia and suggests the Ahiawa king wielded significant influence in the region. Here, in dusty diplomatic correspondence, we glimpse Greeks and Trojans operating in the same strategic space, their interests colliding in ways that could spark conflict. But perspective matters crucially here. From the Hittite viewpoint, events in distant Wailusa were minor border troubles, barely worth mentioning in their extensive archives. From Troy's perspective, these would have been existential threats. From the Greek perspective, an expedition against Troy might have represented the great unifying achievement of their civilization's final generation, important enough to be remembered in oral tradition for centuries after literacy vanished. The stage was set for conflict, strategic location, economic competition, military capability, and cultural values that glorified warfare and plunder. Whether Homer's specific story occurred matters less than understanding that such a conflict was entirely plausible within its historical context. Troy Savina died violently. This is not speculation but archaeological fact. The question is not whether the city was destroyed, but who destroyed it and why. The excavated remains paint a grim picture. The settlement burned intensely, with destruction layers showing temperatures hot enough to vitrify stone and melt bronze. Unlike earlier destruction levels at the site, which show evidence of earthquake damage, Troy's 7A's end came through human agency. Arrowheads and spear points were found embedded in debris. Human remains were discovered in positions suggesting sudden death, without proper burial, a profound violation of Bronze Age religious practice that indicates chaos and catastrophe. The city's defenders had prepared for siege. Streets were narrowed to create defensive bottlenecks. Large storage jars called pithoi were sunk into floors throughout the settlement, suggesting efforts to stockpile supplies for an extended siege. The population appears to have swelled beyond normal levels, perhaps indicating refugees from the surrounding countryside seeking protection behind Troy's massive walls. These are not the archaeological signatures of earthquake or accident, they indicate anticipated attack. Dating this destruction remains imprecise, limited by the available archaeological methods, but converges on approximately 1200 to 1180, before the Common Era. This coincides eerily with ancient Greek tradition, which placed the war's date at approximately 1284 or 1250 before the Common Era, depending on which classical chronology one followed. The ancient historians Herodotus and Thucydides accepted the war as historical fact, disagreeing only about precise dates and details. From the perspective of Troy's inhabitants, the end came with terrifying swiftness. We can imagine watchers on the walls first spotting ships on the horizon, not the usual merchantman, but war vessels, their prows cutting through the waves in formations that spoke of hostile intent. Perhaps they hoped the strangers would pass, raid elsewhere, or prove willing to negotiate. The Greeks had no historical grudge against Troy beyond competition and greed. This was not ethnic warfare or religious crusade, it was the Bronze Age equivalent of corporate raiding, warriors seeking glory through destruction of a wealthy target. The siege, if Homer preserves any memory of reality, lasted years. Archaeology cannot measure siege duration precisely, but the evidence of preparation suggests Troy's defenders knew the threat was serious and expected prolonged conflict. They would have had advantages: massive fortifications, knowledge of the terrain, access to water sources, and likely support from Hittilan territories inland. But siegecraft in the Bronze Age favored patience. Attackers would blockade, raid the countryside, intercept supplies, and wait for starvation, disease, or despair to crack the defenders' resolve. The Trojan perspective in this crisis is forever lost to us. They left no written records that survived. We know their city only through Greek poetry and archaeological remains, but we can infer their desperation from the evidence, the crowded conditions, hidden food stores, the preparations that suggested they knew death approached their walls. They were not the romantic heroes of Homer's poem, they were Bronze Age Anatolians, caught between Greek aggression and Hittite decline, fighting for survival in a collapsing world. The final assault, however it came, succeeded catastrophically. Whether through the famous stratagem of the wooden horse which might preserve genuine memory of a deceptive tactic, or through simpler means of walls breached or gates betrayed, the defenses failed. Fire consumed the city. Defenders died where they stood. The archaeological record suggests no gradual abandonment, no organized evacuation, but sudden violent termination. For the attackers, this was victory, the culmination of years of effort, losses, and frustration. For Bronze Age warriors, sacking a city brought tangible rewards: precious metals, weapons, tools, cloth, oil, wine, and most importantly, enslaved persons who represented concentrated wealth and labor. A successful siege paid for itself many times over through plunder, making the years of investment worthwhile. Troy Savina was not rebuilt immediately. The site lay substantially abandoned for a generation or more, suggesting the destruction was thorough enough to eliminate the city as a functioning political entity. The strategic position remained valuable, and eventually new settlers arrived, but they built on ruins. The destruction of Troy Savina occurred at the precipice of catastrophe. Within decades of Troy's fall, the entire Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed into chaos that scholars still struggle to fully explain. Nearly every major city from Greece to the Levant burned. Literacy vanished across vast regions. International trade networks that had functioned for centuries disintegrated. Population levels plummeted. The archaeological record shows civilization itself seemed to stagger and nearly fall. For the victorious Greeks, if Greeks indeed destroyed Troy, victory proved Pyrrhic beyond measure. The Mycenaean palace centers that might have organized such an expedition: Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos. Thebes all met violent ends within a generation or two of 1200 before the Common Era. Pylos burned so suddenly that linear B tablets, recording daily palace business, were accidentally preserved through firing, frozen mid-transaction as disaster struck. The tablets mention coastal watchers, military preparations, and anxiety about threats from the sea, suggesting the Mycenaeans knew destruction approached, but could not prevent it. Greek tradition itself preserved dark memories of this period. The myths speak of cursed homecomings, Agamemnon murdered by his wife upon returning from Troy, Odysseus wandering for years before finding his kingdom diminished, Ajax driven mad and dishonored. These stories, whatever their historical basis, reflect a cultural memory of victory that brought no peace, conquest that yielded no prosperity, and warriors who returned to find their own world collapsing. The perspective of the broader Mediterranean world matters here. Egypt's records describe invasions by sea peoples, coalition forces of uncertain origin, who attacked by land and sea, destroying cities throughout the Levant and threatening Egypt itself. Pharaoh Ramesses III repelled these invaders around 1177 before the Common Era. But the cost was enormous, and Egyptian power never fully recovered. The Hittite Empire simply ceased to exist, its capital Hattusa abandoned and burned, its archive of diplomatic correspondence ending abruptly with references to famine and crisis. Some scholars suggest the Mycenaean Greeks themselves, displaced by troubles at home or seeking new lands after their own palaces fell, became part of these sea peoples. If so, the destroyers of Troy became refugees and raiders themselves, contributing to the very collapse that had destroyed their own civilization. The line between victor and victim blurred in the chaos. Troy's destruction, whether caused by Greeks or other forces, eliminated one node in a fragile network of trade, diplomacy, and stability. Bronze Age civilization depended on international exchange: copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, or possibly Cornwall, luxury goods from Egypt, grain from the Black Sea coast. Disrupt enough connections, destroy enough trading centers, and the entire system could cascade into failure. Troy's fall, rather than being an isolated event, was part of a systemic collapse that historians still debate. The survivor's perspective reveals the human cost. Archaeological surveys of Greece show population levels dropped by as much as 75% in some regions between 1200 and 1100. Before the Common Era, villages were abandoned. Monumental architecture ceased. Luxury goods disappeared from the archaeological record. People reverted to subsistence agriculture, isolated communities clinging to survival. Literacy vanished so completely that when writing returned to Greece centuries later, it was a completely different script, the alphabet borrowed from Phoenicia, bearing no relationship to the linear B of the palace bureaucracies. For Troy specifically, the site shows sparse occupation in the centuries following 7A's destruction. The great days were over. When new settlers arrived, they built a modest settlement on the ruins, nothing approaching the city's former glory. The strategic location remained valuable, but the wealth and power were gone. Later Greek colonists, arriving in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, believed this was Homer's Troy and made it a cult site, offering sacrifices and honoring the heroes of the legendary war. The irony is profound. The Greeks who may have destroyed Troy lost their own civilization shortly afterward. The victory, if it occurred, brought nothing but ashes. The war entered legend precisely because the world that fought it vanished, leaving only poetry to preserve dimly remembered glory from an age that seemed golden in retrospect but ended in universal catastrophe. What remains 3,000 years later is not certainty, but layered possibilities. The Trojan War exists simultaneously as archaeological fact, as city destroyed violently in the correct period, and as literary masterpiece whose relationship to historical reality remains ambiguous. The truth likely resides somewhere between Homer's poetry and the excavated ruins. Neither pure myth nor simple history, but memory transformed by centuries of oral tradition. The process of remembering matters crucially. After the Bronze Age collapse, Greece entered a dark age lasting roughly for centuries, from 1100 to 800 before the Common Era. During this period, literacy vanished, monumental architecture ceased, and material culture impoverished dramatically. Yet oral tradition continued, passing stories from generation to generation. Professional bards memorized vast repertoires of poetry, preserving tales of the glorious past when kings lived in golden palaces and heroes fought beneath the walls of Troy. Homer, whoever that name represents, composed the Iliad around the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, some 400 years after Troy's 7A's destruction. His poem preserves authentic Bronze Age details, accurate descriptions of Mycenaean armor, social structures, and geography, alongside anachronistic elements from his own time. The text is a palimpsest, layers of historical periods overlapping. Bronze Age core overlaid with Iron Age additions, memory mixed with imagination. Modern archaeological and linguistic scholarship has vindicated Homer in unexpected ways. Excavations prove Troy was real and was destroyed in the right period. Linear B decipherment showed Homer's Achaeans spoke Greek. Hittite archives confirmed political geography and conflicts in western Anatolia. Yet nothing in the archaeological or textual record confirms specific individuals, no evidence for Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, or Helen as historical persons. The names might be genuine, or might be later inventions, or might represent amalgamations of multiple figures from different periods. The historical truth probably resembles this: late Bronze Age Greeks, organized in some form of coalition, attacked and destroyed the wealthy trading city of Troy around 1200 before the Common Era. Motivated by strategic and economic interests rather than romantic causes, the siege may have been lengthy. The city's destruction was violent and thorough. This event, significant to its participants, was remembered in oral tradition and gradually elaborated, acquiring emotional depth, romantic motivation, divine intervention, and narrative structure as it passed through generations of bards. The lasting significance lies less in determining whether Achilles existed than in recognizing what the story reveals about human nature. The Trojan War narrative explores themes eternal to warfare, the disconnect between glorious ideals and brutal reality. The suffering of civilians caught in conflicts they did not choose, the questionable value of victory purchased through years of bloodshed, the cursed legacy of violence that destroys victor and vanquished alike. Troy's perspective, silenced by its destruction and obscured by Greek literary dominance, reminds us that history is written by survivors. The Trojans likely considered themselves victims of unprovoked aggression, defending their homes against foreign raiders. The Greeks saw themselves as righteous warriors seeking justice or glory. Both perspectives contained truth. Neither was complete. The archaeological site at Hisarlik today sits quiet under Turkish sun, its multiple layers exposed by excavation revealing the rise and fall of civilizations across millennia. Tourists walk where Bronze Age warriors may have fought, where fires consumed homes, where empires collided. The stones tell their own truth. Destruction came here repeatedly, as is the nature of strategic locations throughout history. What remains certain is this: around 1200 before the Common Era, a prosperous Bronze Age city at the strategic entrance to the Dardanelles met violent destruction. Whether it fell to organized Greek coalition or other forces, the event occurred within a broader pattern of civilization collapse. The survivors' descendants preserved memories that became the foundational epic of Western literature. The historical Trojan War, insofar as one occurred, matters less for its factual details than for what it represents: the eternal human capacity for both creating and destroying, for remembering past glories while forgetting past costs, for transforming tragedy into legend and finding meaning in ruins.